In September of 1856, in a house on Esplanade Avenue belonging to one of the most prominent families in New Orleans, a housemaid found a photograph hidden behind a false panel in an old writing desk, and for 3 days afterward, no one in the household would speak of it above a whisper. The desk had stood in the same study for 2 generations, moved only when new shelving required it. And it was in the course of that ordinary task that a maid named Odette felt the wood shift slightly beneath her palm. Behind the panel lay a single photographic plate mounted on stiff card. It showed a black woman of approximately 30 years, dressed with the plainness of domestic service, looking directly into the lens with an expression witnesses would later struggle to name. Not fear exactly, and not defiance, but something unresolved between the two. Tied into her hair was a ribbon of red cloth, knotted with unusual precision, as though positioned rather than simply worn. On the back of the card, in handwriting that could not later be confidently attributed to either a man or a woman, someone had written a single sentence in French. Elle n'appartient pas à cette maison. She does not belong to this house. That same week, a woman known to the household only as Louise, who had lived and worked on the upper floor for a length of time no one could later agree upon, was no longer present. No notice of her absence reached the city authorities. No reward was posted in the Picayune or the Bee, as would have been customary had she been believed to have fled captivity. No inquiry, no advertisement, no mention in any surviving household ledger. She was, in every documentary sense, a woman who had first never existed and then stopped existing, with nothing connecting the two states except a hidden photograph and a maid's shaking hands. The photograph did not surface again for 36 years. According to later testimony, it remained in the possession of a Delacroix relation who found it either too strange or too dangerous to discuss, until 1892, when the property finally changed hands. The new owner, a shipping agent unconnected to the family's history, hired a document appraiser named Elias Fontenot to catalogue the papers left behind. Fontenot was 46, meticulous by reputation, known among the city's notarial circles for his ability to reconstruct the financial lives of the dead from fragments others considered worthless. He had no reason to expect that a routine inventory of tax receipts and correspondence would consume the final years of his working life, nor that it would end in a silence he could never fully explain to anyone who later asked him about it. Before the discovery, the house had operated with the outward calm, typical of families whose wealth had long since settled into habit. Auguste Delacroix, the notary who managed the family's affairs and those of several allied households, had built his practice on a reputation for discretion, a quality especially valued by clients whose dealings benefited from remaining unexamined. His wife, Cécile, ran the domestic side of the household with an attentiveness that extended to every linen and every servant's schedule, though the letters Fontenot later recovered suggest she took considerable care never to ask what occupied her husband beyond his official hours. Their son studied law in Baton Rouge. Their daughter had recently married into the Vautrin family, a detail that would later prove far more significant than anyone in 1856 could have known. It is largely through this daughter's casual, domestic correspondence, letters written with no awareness of their future importance, that anything at all is known of the girl upstairs. The seamstress's days followed a narrow, repetitive shape. As far as they can be reconstructed from later testimony, she rose before the rest of the household, took her meals apart from the other servants, according to an instruction no one could later explain, and spent most of her hours in a small room on the uppermost floor, fitted with a single window facing the courtyard rather than the street. Visitors rarely saw her at all, and those who did agreed on one detail above all others. She was never without the ribbon. She appeared in the family's private letters only obliquely, never named directly in any formal document, but mentioned in domestic correspondence spanning several years. One letter from the newly married Vautrin daughter to a cousin in Baton Rouge asked whether the girl upstairs might be permitted to alter a wedding dress before the season's end. Another, from an aunt visiting from Mobile, complained that the seamstress with the red ribbon had taken too long mending a morning gown. The third, written by Auguste Delacroix himself, instructed a housekeeper in unambiguous terms. The upstairs woman was not to receive visitors of any kind, under any circumstance, and the instruction was not open to discussion. When Fontenot began cross-referencing the household's formal inventories, documents that in that era listed enslaved people alongside furniture and livestock with the same administrative indifference, he found no woman answering to this description, no entry for Louise, no seamstress recorded in any list of household property, no baptismal notice, no medical record, no bill of sale. A woman who had occupied the upper floor for years, who had mended garments for weddings and funerals alike, who was explicitly forbidden from leaving unaccompanied, appeared to have been carefully excised from every document capable of proving she had ever set foot in the house at all. It was this absence, more than the photograph itself, that Fontenot found impossible to set aside. His work might have ended there, filed away as an unresolved curiosity, had he not been engaged some months later to catalogue a separate estate, that of the Vautrin family, into which the Delacroix daughter had married. Sorting through a box of old daguerreotypes, Fontenot came across an image that stopped him mid-motion. The woman photographed bore what his own notes describe as an exactness of resemblance that cannot be attributed to coincidence. The same set of the jaw, the same manner of holding the shoulders, and unmistakably the same ribbon, tied in the same fashion. Yet in the Vautrin family's records, this woman carried an entirely different name, Adeline Baptiste, a free woman of colour who had worked as an embroiderer in the French Quarter until her disappearance in 1852. 4 years before the photograph in the Delacroix desk had even been taken. Fontenot's notes from this period grow visibly more cautious in their phrasing, as though he sensed even then that he was documenting something meant never to be documented at all. He began seeking out anyone who might have known Adeline Baptiste while she was still, by every legal measure, a free woman. Records showed she had been born free, the daughter of a free woman of colour and a shipwright of French descent, and had received an education uncommon for a woman of her class and race in that period. She had operated a small embroidery workshop near Rue Dauphine, modest, but respected among a certain clientele until the death of an older woman who had held her certificate of freedom for safekeeping, a common arrangement among free people of colour, given the constant danger of having one's status challenged by anyone willing to forge the right paperwork. It was this death, Fontenot came to believe, that created the vulnerability someone had been waiting for. A third photograph deepened the mystery considerably, discovered nearly 2 years into Fontenot's research, long after his employer had stopped paying for the appraisal and Fontenot had continued regardless at his own expense, in a manner several acquaintances later described as bordering on obsession. This image belonged to the estate of a deceased merchant named Cyrus Whitfield. The same woman appeared once more, identical in every physical detail Fontenot had learned to catalogue, but under yet a third name, Marguerite Bell, recorded plainly as domestic property acquired at a private auction, with no further biographical notation beyond a purchase figure and a date. 3 names, 3 households, 1 woman, 1 ribbon, positioned identically in every surviving image. Fontenot brought the photographs to a bookbinder named Geneviève Moreau, 58 years old, who had spent her younger years employed in the back offices of several notarial practices, repairing and binding the ledgers that gave the profession its appearance of permanence. She recognized the ribbon at once. Fontenot recorded this recognition with evident relief in his notes, believing he had finally found someone willing to explain what he had spent years failing to understand. That relief did not survive the conversation. Moreau grew quiet, then evasive, deflecting his visits for weeks with a vagueness Fontenot eventually learned to recognize not as ignorance, but as fear. It was only after repeated visits, and, by his own account, a considerable exercise of patience, that Moreau finally spoke plainly. The ribbon, she told him, was not an ornament chosen by the woman who wore it. It was a marking system, understood only within a narrow circle of intermediaries, certain notaries, certain brokers, certain buyers, who dealt in transactions that could never appear in any official register. A red ribbon, tied in that specific manner, identified a person whose legal documents had been deliberately falsified, someone whose freedom had been erased on paper, whose identity had been quietly rewritten to permit sale, transfer, or continued concealment, all without whatever minimal safeguards a free person of color was nominally entitled to under the law of the period. The mechanism, as Moreau described it, and as Fontenot later confirmed through the household's own correspondence, operated with a bureaucratic coldness that horrified him more, he later admitted, than any single act of violence could have. Rather than bring a woman like Adeline before a court where she might have called upon witnesses to testify to her free birth, a notary such as Auguste Delacroix would manufacture a debt she had supposedly never repaid, produce a sworn statement alleging she had falsified her own papers, and declare her, on the strength of these documents alone, an enslaved fugitive traveling under a false identity. Once such a claim existed on paper, no court felt compelled to verify it further. The burden of disproving it fell entirely and often impossibly upon the woman herself. She would be transferred between cooperating households, families who either profited directly from the arrangement or simply asked no questions. Her name altered with each transfer, her prior identity dissolved a little further each time, until nothing remained to connect Adeline Baptiste, embroiderer of Rue Dauphine, to Louise, seamstress of the upper floor, to Marguerite Bell, domestic property of Cyrus Whitfield. The full extent of the scheme became clear to Fontenot only when he located, among a set of ledgers slated for disposal following a municipal building renovation, a small cash book written in a private code. Beside certain payment entries was drawn a small looped mark, a ribbon rendered in miniature. Fontenot spent nearly a year working out the correspondences between these entries and the public record, and what he found left him unable to sleep, by his own description, for a period of several weeks. The entries corresponded to 23 adult women who had lived as free persons of color in New Orleans, and subsequently vanished from every public register. Seamstresses, laundresses, cooks, small tradeswomen. What united them was not merely their race and sex, but the fact that each possessed some form of property, savings, or claim to real estate that had drawn the attention of others. Their names were replaced one by one. Their personal histories were dismantled through manufactured debts and false depositions, until their assets passed quietly into the hands of men connected to the same small circle of notaries. Adeline, it seemed, had discovered the shape of this operation almost by accident, through the very ordinariness of her labor. As the seamstress responsible for mending garments and draperies throughout the Delacroix residence, she had access to rooms and papers a woman of her position was neither expected nor permitted to read, let alone remember. Fontenot's reconstruction, built from whatever fragments survived, suggested she had spent months quietly copying names, dates, and sums from correspondence left in Auguste Delacroix's private study. Work performed most likely in stolen minutes between mending tasks, under constant risk of discovery. The photograph hidden in the desk, Fontenot came to believe, had been taken by a studio assistant sympathetic to her situation, intended as proof of her true identity should she disappear. As she seemed already to have feared, she eventually would. The sentence written on the back of that photograph, Fontenot eventually concluded, carried far more weight than its 6 words suggested. It was not merely a private accusation that Adeline did not legally belong to the household holding her. It was an indictment of every document ever used to justify her captivity. A quiet, deliberate rebuttal, left behind for whoever might one day think to look. What became of her on the night of her disappearance emerged only through a letter that, according to Fontenot's notes, had apparently never been sent. Discovered folded inside the lining of an old trunk, addressed to no one in particular, written by an adult household employee whose name Fontenot chose, for reasons he never recorded, not to preserve. The letter described Adeline being removed from the property in the early hours of the morning and brought to a warehouse near the docks. There was no bill of sale associated with the transfer, the letter claimed, because she was meant to receive yet another identity and be sent beyond Louisiana entirely, beyond any possibility of the truth catching up with her. The ship's manifest for that night, when Fontenot finally located it decades later among poorly preserved municipal shipping records, was missing a page, torn out cleanly near the binding. What remained was a partial list, on which appeared a single passenger without a surname, described only as Woman 30 years seamstress Red Ribbon. Fontenot attempted near the end of his investigation to bring his findings to a local newspaper. The publication declined to print any of it. Many of the families implicated in his research still held considerable political and financial influence in the city, and the descendants of the notaries involved threatened him through their attorneys with legal action for defamation should he attempt to publish by any other means. Shortly afterward, the coded cash book, the single piece of physical evidence connecting 23 separate disappearances to a common scheme, vanished from the locked office where Fontenot had been keeping it. Geneviève Moreau, when he approached her again, denied ever having held or seen such a book and ended all further contact with him. He placed a single small notice in a local paper asking for any information regarding a woman named Adeline Baptiste. No one ever responded. In the years that followed, Fontenot's household staff noted a change in his habits that several later described carefully as a kind of quiet fixation rather than any dramatic decline. He kept the 23 ribbon-wrapped names in a locked drawer of his own desk, taking them out periodically to reread the notes he had made beside each one, though he added nothing further to the file after around 1898. A niece who visited him in his final years recalled that he sometimes spoke of the seamstress as though she were a person he had personally known, though he had, of course, never met her. She had been dead, or at minimum vanished, for decades before he was ever born. He died in 1907. His personal papers, by his own written instruction, were donated to a small local library rather than retained within his family. Catalogued among them, decades later, were the 23 strips of red ribbon, each stitched carefully around a folded paper bearing a true name alongside a list of false ones the woman in question had been forced to carry. Adeline's was the only one accompanied by a separate note in Fontenot's own hand. She gathered the other names before they could erase her own. No surviving document ever confirmed where Adeline Baptiste's life ultimately ended. The original photograph from the Delacroix desk disappeared as well, at some point during the library's own long history of transfers and reorganizations, leaving behind only a poorly reproduced copy in which the red ribbon has faded into something closer to a dark smudge above her hair. For many years afterward, the story of the seamstress and her ribbon existed only within a narrow circle of local historians and archivists who had encountered Fontenot's donated papers and found them impossible to file away as mere curiosity. It resurfaced publicly only once more, in the summer of 1964, when a graduate researcher named Dorothea Prescott, working through the library's uncatalogued acquisitions for a thesis on antebellum domestic labor, came across the small box of ribbons and Fontenot's accompanying notes. Prescott was thorough in a way the library's own staff had apparently never been. She cross-referenced Fontenot's list of 23 names against surviving parish records, notarial archives, and the fragmentary shipping registers of the period, and in doing so confirmed independently much of what Fontenot had already concluded, that a network of notaries and brokers, operating primarily between 1840 and 1858, had systematically targeted free women of color who held property or savings, using manufactured debts and falsified depositions to strip them of their legal status and their assets simultaneously. She found, in the process, 2 additional names that did not appear on Fontenot's original list, suggesting the true scope of the operation had been larger even than he had estimated. Prescott's research drew the attention of a small regional historical society, which invited her to present her findings at a modest gathering in the spring of 1965. According to the one surviving account of that evening, written years later by an attendee, Prescott's presentation was met with a silence that seemed at the time more like discomfort than genuine interest. Several descendants of families named in the old correspondence were reportedly present, though none spoke during the discussion that followed. Prescott herself apparently found this reception unsurprising. In a letter to a colleague, later preserved among her own donated papers, she wrote that she had expected exactly this kind of quiet, since, in her words, the entire mechanism depended on silence. And silence does not disappear simply because the paperwork has been found. What became of Prescott's fuller research remains, itself, a matter of some uncertainty. She had intended, by her own correspondence, to publish an expanded account incorporating both Fontenot's original findings and her own additional documentation. A university press had expressed interest, according to a letter dated late 1966. But no manuscript was ever completed, or at least none has ever surfaced. Prescott herself moved out of the city the following year, citing in one brief note only personal reasons for the relocation, and her subsequent correspondence with colleagues in the field grows noticeably thinner after that point, tapering off almost entirely by the end of the decade. Whether this had any connection to her research into the Delacroix and Vautrin families, or was simply the ordinary drift of one life away from an early academic interest, no surviving document makes clear. The library itself preserved Prescott's notes alongside Fontenot's original papers, and it was here, buried within her cross-referencing, that a detail emerged which neither Fontenot nor any prior account had noted. A brief mention, in the margin of a shipping ledger from 1856, of a woman disembarking at a port along the Gulf Coast under the name Marie Colbert, matching almost precisely the physical description used elsewhere for woman 30 years, seamstress, red ribbon. No further record of a Marie Colbert could be located in that town's own surviving archives, and whether this name represented Adeline's final identity, an unrelated coincidence, or simply another woman caught within the same broader scheme, could never be determined with any confidence. What can be said with more certainty is this: the house on Esplanade Avenue changed hands several more times over the following century, its upper floor eventually subdivided into smaller apartments during a renovation in the 1920s. The small room with its single courtyard-facing window absorbed entirely into a larger space, and its original dimensions lost to memory along with everything else. No plaque marks the house. No formal inquiry was ever opened into the deaths, disappearances or dispossessions of the 23 women named in Fontenotte's cash book, nor into whatever additional names Dorothea Prescott may have uncovered and never published. The notarial families implicated in the correspondence continued, for the most part, to hold respected positions within the city for generations afterward, their own family histories recording nothing of the matter at all. Occasionally, according to library staff who worked with the Fontenot and Prescott collections in later decades, a visiting researcher or a distant descendant of one of the 23 named women would come across the ribbons in the archive and ask to see them, holding the small strips of faded red cloth for a long moment before asking, invariably, some version of the same question, whether anyone had ever found out what finally happened to her. The answer in every case remained the same. No one ever had. The photograph itself, the one found behind the false panel in 1856, examined by Fontenot in 1892, and lost sometime during the library's later reorganizations, exists now only in the single degraded reproduction Fontenot commissioned before it vanished. In that copy, the ribbon has faded into little more than a dark smear above the woman's hair, and her expression, once described by witnesses as neither fear nor defiance but something unresolved between them, has blurred into something closer to a shadow than a face. It is, by every account, the only image remaining anywhere of a woman who was, across 3 separate households and at least 3 separate identities, one of the 23 whose names, property, and legal existence were quietly and deliberately taken from her. And the only one, according to Fontenot's own final note, who found a way to ensure that the names of the others would not vanish along with her own.